Brilliant. What a fantastic way to kick off this webinar. Welcome everyone, and welcome to our guest today. So London Calling, very appropriate today. It is the official back to work day. We will touch on that and some of the consequences of that and the preparation, and maybe try and look at the future. So I won't introduce all the guests in detail, but because they're better placed to list that themselves. But Kate Buxton, Ruth Dustin and Simon Looms are here, and we will very much appreciate their input from bid and property perspective. Unfortunately, Nikki Aiken MP is not here. She sent her apologies, some very urgent late notice parliamentary business, and it's one of the downfalls of actually getting an MP on a webinar like this is that they are often pulled away at short notice, but we will no doubt return to Nikki at a future point. So I'll kick off a bit different. We'll have a few polls in this seminar, and one will a little bit more light touch. But this webinar really is about looking at the growth of business improvement districts, London return to work, the role of the property sector within those bids, and actually there are now specific property bids as well. And the property industry plays an absolute crucial part in the work of bid and has a vested interest. So I'm probably going to kick off with you, Ruth, actually. Really, like how have you been dealing with the challenges of lockdown? Maybe you could start off by, because you obviously run quite a few bids across the city and West End and wider. So maybe tell us a little bit more about your role and how you've been coping during lockdown.
Great, thanks Charles, and good afternoon to everybody. Yes, and as Charles has said, I'm fortunate enough to work across a number of business improvement districts in central London, which includes both the City of London, Westminster and Camden as well. And I think from a bid perspective, I think we are very well placed in terms of adding real value to the whole recovery effort, not least because collaboration and partnership is very much at the heart of the bid model. I think we've seen the power of partnership working in action since the crisis first hit, and this is continuing as we sort of embark on that tentative recovery period. For us, it's been very much about supporting, real vulnerable communities in the early days of lockdown, and that includes our big rough sleeping community as well, which we do a lot of work with across our bid footprints. It's also been working with charities, the police, the local authorities, and our transport operators, as well as obviously Westminster City Council and the City Corporation. And we've played quite a vital role in that planning for opening up our bid districts for business again. I think it's important that the business voice is very much heard, and not least during the crisis. And I think the position that we hold is that we're able to lobby on behalf of our members in terms of unlocking support and overcoming barriers. But I think for us, I think the big key thing is having that clear and consistent communication. And I think that's absolutely crucial in a crisis. And I think if anybody's been following how Oxford Street's been opening up today, there's a massive ask in terms of a big behaviour change here. And I think this is where the huge challenge lies. And I think this is where business improvement districts can work alongside our public service providers in terms of looking at what that communication and that messaging should look like in order for us to open up safely so that people feel safe and secure as they come into our bid districts.
Yeah, and pick up on the, I think we were discussing before we went live, some, and hopefully isolated, but some, there was a bit of a media scrum around Oxford Circus, and lots of, people clearly not social distancing, probably other parts of the street, hopefully okay. I know, we haven't involved Denmark in this webinar today, but we know, along with all bids, there's been loads of work put in preparation, as you say, Ruth, for the public. This is about behavioural change. So, and we'll pick up some of those themes in a little bit as well, because also the issues as well as behaviour change in terms of transport capacity and cycling and how people are going to interact, with the neighbourhood. Now, Kay, I've called everything a bid. You don't, the Paddington Partnership is not a bid, you do run a bid as well. But just explain a little bit about Paddington Partnership and your work. It's a bit different area.
Well, thank you, Charles. So I head up the Paddington Partnership. That's the development coordination vehicle for the Paddington Opportunity Area. So not a bid, it's a voluntary sort of collective really of the main developers and landlords in Paddington covering the POA. So mixed use development, primarily office, but an awful lot of resi, and all connected through the spine that is really the canal, which connects all the different schemes. So we've got the major landowners, British Land, Derwent London, Settler, Tishman, European Land. So the majority of the names that you'll be familiar with. And we've got an awful lot on site as well. I think that's a really interesting bit about sites did go a little bit quiet, but they're still fully building. So we've got 4 different schemes on site at the moment and about 600,000 square feet of office under development at the moment. So huge sort of confidence continues at Paddington. That's right next to Paddington Bid and Marble Arch Bid. So Paddington Bid looks after the older part of Paddington, sort of south of Parade Street, make sure those businesses are connected. And then also Marble Arch Bid, which again coterminous, so runs all the way from the Marylebone flyover down to Park Lane and includes part of the Portland Estate and the Church Commission Estate, so east and west of Edgware Road. So quite different, and we are, I suppose Edgware Road is more like a high street, not a retail destination as such. So it's remained open throughout. You wouldn't really know there was a lockdown if you visited Edgware Road. Full of supermarkets, pharmacies, banks, very small units. So it has been, I think, maybe about bar 6 shops. It's been open the whole time. So we've had to respond quite differently and get in very early on some of the movement strategy work with TfL that Ruth's alluded to. But yeah, so interesting times.
And the Paddington Partnership is really about utilising the opportunity area, isn't it? To really driving the opportunity within the opportunity area, right? And that's one place in the new city plan where we'll be able to have tall buildings.
Absolutely, and I think that we've got about 25,000 employees there. We're expecting, based on sort of straw polls from all landlords with all companies, and we're in the middle of, I think for Derwent, I don't Derwent on today, but for Derwent in particular, one of their buildings will actually be in the middle of being fitted out and occupied. So that's the Brunel building. So we've got companies in the middle of moving into that building, straddling 2 different sites, but they have to stop moving. But we're looking at about 30% occupancy over the summer maximum, really. And one of the big challenges is obviously making them feel safe to get once they're back at work, making sure the transport is safe to enable them to get to work, creating safe routes for them in terms of walking and cycling, and making sure that the F&B amenity that supports them is able to survive. And that's a key message I think that will come through today, as well as making sure that F&B sector survives. But also protecting the open spaces we've got. What makes Paddington successful is working environment as well as floor plates. And I think the interesting bit about social distancing is that, and the amount of commercial we've got on site, is that Paddington will become even more popular. We have got these amazing spaces that people use. We've got the water space, we've got the canal side, great amphitheatres, great open spaces at Paddington. So people are able to move a little bit more freely than maybe they would in a more dense sort of commercial district. And we do benefit from that. So I think that will be quite an interesting challenge. The big challenge is obviously the towpath, where we're encouraging more people to cycle, we're encouraging more F&B to put tables and chairs out, and we're encouraging more people to walk. And there's only a finite amount of towpath. So that's a big project for us as we start to repopulate and mobilise, I suppose, on occupation.
Simon Moon's WPA board, but strategic projects director at Portman Estate. You're also on the board of the Paddington Bid. I think you're the chair of the Paddington Marble Arch Bid, Marble Arch London Bid. So a bit of a crossover there with Kay. Obviously, you work closely, and listening to Kay there, you really sense that kind of deep knowledge of the area and actually a real focus of the plan of what's required and how it's different. But perhaps you could pick that up in terms of your Marble Arch hat on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Charles, and good afternoon, everybody. So Kay and I work together very closely. Kay is the chief executive, and I'm one of the vice chairs. Marble Arch Bid covers Edgware Road from Marble Arch itself up to the flyover at the A40. and that's really sort of the central London core district for Edgware Road. I mean, I think it's fair to say that BIDS are very passionate about their area. I think that's one of their strengths. You know, the core team really has the vibrancy and the success of their areas at their heart. And BIDS have been under a lot of strain. I'm probably speaking for all BIDS across the country, particularly those in central London. A lot of strain over recent times. They're small teams in themselves. They're small businesses, and they need to stay afloat as well. You know, I think a lot of the BIDS went straight in and furloughed a lot of their team, which placed quite a good deal of strain on the team that was left, and left them to pick up the whole breadth of the work that the BIDS do in terms of operations, marketing, public realm support, and communications. But I think as we come out of this situation, the BIDS are probably the most important organisation in any commercial area, next to the council, in ensuring that the success of that particular commercial business district in coming out of lockdown. And so it's vital that those teams can continue, that the BIDS get the cash flow in from their levy members to support the unfurloughing of their teams and get them back up to full strength in good time, ready for the release of lockdown. And that's to provide support for businesses, retailers to a degree, and you'll see retailers are a core part of, say, New West End Company's bid. But alongside retailers, you have office occupiers and hotels in the other West End and City business improvement districts. So those hotels and office occupiers, are members that need support at this time as well.
So Simon, obviously Portman Estate owns swathe, it's a big swathe of property and land, and any property owner pays a levy on their business rates for the establishment of BIDS. So for some, you're talking quite significant sums of money. So one point you made is that BIDS really vary in terms of their resource and size and remit. And I think people think of the NWEC is the largest and the most high profile area, but not all BIDS operate in that way or similar structure. It'd be interesting to hear more.
Absolutely, Charles. So for those that are not aware, Business Improvement District takes a levy based on a percentage of the business rates. And normally that would be about 1.5%. But obviously the size of that collective levy is different for different areas. And the reason NWEC is so large is firstly it's two BIDS, and a property owner and a property occupier business improvement district, managed separately but ostensibly run by the same organisation. And equally, the main value is in that Oxford Street, Regent Street, Bond Street area. If you come out to a more peripheral area of the West End, such as Edgware Road, Marble Arch, the Marble Arch bid has an income of about 650,000. So that's significantly different to the millions of pounds that NWEC has at its disposal. So that's enough to provide for a small team and to pay for some small amount of public realm works. But fundamentally, that goes into funding a street and ambassadorial team, marketing, communications, keeping the show on the road. So cash flow is all important at this point in time. And you can imagine a lot of the levy members are finding it difficult to meet that levy amongst all their other bills they need to pay. But BIDS are not capable of borrowing. They can't borrow from the banks. They're short-term businesses which need to be renewed generally every 5 years. So to get the teams back up to full speed, that levy needs to come in. So if you like, they're in the same boat as their member organisations in the area they're working for.
And I think we've got a poll which hopefully will flash up in a minute. So on what people feel should be the role of BIDS, or it'd be interesting to see how that relays. So now it blocks my face out, which is probably a blessing for everyone, depending on where the camera is for each person. But Simon, you mentioned something which I want to pick up with Ruth actually, because you talked about how BIDS working alongside the local authority, most important organisation alongside. So Ruth, are the BIDS doing the work of local authorities to a degree, things which once the public sector paid for out of public funds? And maybe while you're answering that, how did they all come about, and why they grown so exponentially?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Well, obviously BIDS was started, probably over 50 years ago outside of the UK, and they've been in the UK for coming up to 20 years in a few years' time. And And we've got over 300 across the UK now, over 60 working across London. And the vast majority are occupier business improvement districts, but obviously there are a couple of property owner bids which we've touched on. There's only 2 actually that operate in the United Kingdom at the moment in London, and that's the New West End Company and the Heart of London Business Alliance. I think in terms of the role and prominence of bids, they have grown in the last 10 to 12 years. So when they were first established, it was all very much focusing on a lot of tactical delivery, lots of nice hanging baskets, a bit of street cleaning, lots of events and other activities. But I think they have grown to become much more strategic in the cities and towns where they operate. And I think they are real powerful strategic forces for good. I think we work very well in partnership with our local authorities and our other public service providers. That's not to say that we're here to replace the role of the local authority, but very much to add value and complement the work that they do and the work that they undertake. And I think over the years we've really seen bids evolve to take on, you know, that real custodian stewardship of the areas that they operate and they function within. To be those strategic players. As Simon touched on, bids vary in shape, in size, in their makeup, the characteristic, the area that they represent, and therefore their budgets do too. But I do think that all bids absolutely punch above their weight, and I think they are a great leveraging model in terms of driving forward big catalyst projects for the areas that they represent. And I'm sure between Kay, Simon and myself, we've got some fantastic examples of that. And we know North Bank is a great example with Strand Aldwych, which is a big public realm scheme with a potential £28 million investment that's going into that with Westminster City Council. I think that the big question is that it has been born out of a lot of good relationship building with the local authorities. And should we look to harness that further, and should there be a more formalised structure in place? Because there is no formal arrangement. We have perhaps a memorandum of understanding or an operating agreement in place with our local authority or with the city corporation, depending on where the bid is. But should we have a more formalised structure in place so that that bid voice is being heard in a more formalised way to move some of these big public realm strategies forward, which the private sector are going to have to contribute towards going forward in future years?
I mean, you touched on that in terms of really interesting proposals. You touched on, I know, Marble Arch, you have huge proposals there which will transform the area. Baker Street, we didn't really talk about your work on Baker Street, Simon. So perhaps if you could quickly touch on those 2 big projects.
So from our perspective, Charles, we're a landlord of a particular geographical area, but you know, we only have a certain degree of mandate in that area by virtue of being a landowner, a landlord. I think what bids do is that they put their arms around all the occupiers in the area and the other property owners who all have a vested interest. And they look at it from a geographical perspective rather than just a singular land ownership perspective. And those 2 things are very different. It's quite rare that you'll find a landowner having an appropriate geographical representation. So I don't think we could have done the Baker Street two-way scheme, for example, without the Baker Street two-way scheme, business improvement district being in place. And I don't think that we would have seen the junction improvements on Edgware Road that TfL have recently put in without the support that the members and the bid provided for the Edgware Road, you know. And I think Transport for London, the GLA, alongside Westminster, are more and more seeing the benefits of the contact and the communication that the bids can set up amongst their members and amongst the local community to support some of these big public realm schemes. Marble Arch is a case in point, you know, that is a joint offer from the Portman Estate and Marble Arch Business Improvement District. But I don't think we would have been heard in quite the same way had it just been a landowner alone. And
one thing, if Nikki was on the call today, we would have clearly asked her about the Great Recovery Bill. She's, a parliamentary private secretary at MCHLG, and obviously the Great Recovery Bill, we're expecting, you know, imminently changes to planning and licensing and other initiatives to really support the economy, and particularly like properties at the, you know, the vanguard at this, and the, you know, hospitality, leisure, culture industries particularly exposed to the pandemic. So perhaps, Kay, maybe you could pick on in terms of some of the things, you know, you're looking, you know, where you need more support or where businesses need more support.
from local authorities, you mean?
Well, from the government.
Oh, I see. Yeah, definitely. Sorry. I mean, I think definitely on the Great Recovery Bill, we are very much hoping to see a relaxation or a support for expansion of tables and chairs and those sorts of issues. I think it's a very, very delicate balance, and we have to be extremely careful that we do this with support of residential communities, and that we don't end up with unintended consequences on high streets that we can't reverse. So any relaxation measures need to be obviously, supported by the local authority and supported by communities. Westminster do call us place partners, I think, and Ruth will vouch for this, but they've started to call bids place partners, partly because of some of the work that Ruth is doing around with North Bank and what Baker Street have done with Baker Street Two-Way. And I think one of the things that makes us more able to do that is partly a sort of resource and a local knowledge issue, but also that we do have very good relationship with our surrounding community societies and community organisations. And if we're involved in neighbourhood forums in particular, for example, that's been really useful. So on the movement strategy, where bids and landlords were asked to submit ideas for phase 1 and phase 2 of movement strategy, so A, around movement of people, and B, around sort of hospitality, all of those have gone in with the support and discussion with residents to make sure that what does happen will have, as far as possible, residential support. And that does make a big difference. But yes, absolutely need, we've all seen the European cities, all the imagery coming out of European capital cities where they're a month or so ahead of us, and people are feeling all very Parisian. I'm not sure how Parisian we could ever be, but I do think that that's an aspiration, and we've all got locations in which that would look absolutely wonderful. And if we can do it, I would be delighted. I'm sure if you've got locations, Portland State, you've got locations where if we were able to have a sort of European style al fresco sort of experience, and the weather holds up, it will certainly help some of the F&B operators to survive, and also the hotels, because as we know, it's a supply chain that's vertical as well as horizontal in tourism. And if restaurants aren't open and cafes aren't open, then the tourism industry is not going to recover in the same way.
We've had to really put the al fresco in. That there needs to, if the weather stays like this, there could be a positive, not a full rebound, but there's livelihoods are at stake, and businesses are, some are no doubt hanging on a thread, and any support to save jobs and save businesses. I mean, one thing actually, before I pick that up with Ruth, with the results from the poll, over half of our webinar views today, and we've got more than 150 people online today, say the #1 priority for bids should be business support and promotion. So they've got the message. And it's followed very closely, just under 40% for improving public realm, and not that far off for preparing for a safe movement. So talking of safe movement, I mean, especially in the city, Ruth, I mean, there's big changes, temporary changes going on in most parts of London, and Westminster's brought in some measures very quickly which are temporary in nature. We know there are bigger plans for the Oxford district, and I won't say the word pedestrianisation. I'll let Nikki say that if she wanted to. But there are, changes are coming, whether regardless in some form, and obviously what Kay says, with support of local communities. But the city's moving at quite a pace on here, and what an opportunity in terms of cycling and changing behaviours. But what do you see the future for the city there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think businesses, particularly in this crisis, have had to be really agile, really creative in terms of looking at how they survive and how they come out of this. And I have to say, I think the City of London, the City Corporation, have been really ambitious in responding to the challenges that businesses have in terms of looking at the whole public realm and placemaking agenda in and around the square mile. So there's some really ambitious plans already well underway now. The phasing of those is well in. We are looking at large swathes of pedestrianisation in and around the City of London. They focus very much on the Eastern City cluster, the tall building cluster, in terms of pedestrianisation, and in and around the Cheapside area. So some huge opportunities there to really look at how we can have some meanwhile use in terms of what we do with those spaces. Lots of repurposing of the carriageway to make way for more cyclists and more pedestrians. But I think there's an enormous opportunity here to look at the F&B offer, and obviously those outside spaces and how they can be better animated in a more positive way. As we all know, going forward, we will be encouraging people to use outside spaces much more regularly, much more frequently. And I think there's an enormous opportunity to look at how we can use those spaces in the city. But also lends itself in terms of freight consolidation as well, and really trying to move that agenda forward, because I think on paper freight consolidation looks great, but in practice it's not as easy to implement as it reads. And I think that there's an enormous opportunity for us to work collaboratively with the City Corporation through our city bids and city partnerships in terms of looking at freight and how we can have perhaps a better handle and a better control on that. And I will say the City Corporation have been incredibly proactive in terms of how they've been driving that particular agenda forward. And then, as Kay said, I think it's the whole easing of the licensing and planning issues. And again, I think the City of London have been very responsive in terms of looking at encouraging more outdoor seating, really supporting those businesses that work within the F&B sector and the retail sector to be able to utilise those outside spaces so that we can encourage people to come in and move around more safely and feel confident in doing so. And that's not just the city workforce, but that's encouraging our domestic visitors to come into the city as well.
Brilliant. Another poll has very timely has popped up, because we're coming to the end in a few moments. I can't believe nearly 45 minutes has passed. So this is, to try and gauge, appetite for people returning. So in terms of the actual return to work, obviously, we touched on the Great Recovery Bill. What are you looking for from government, Ruth, going forward?
Going forward, the big thing for me is obviously perhaps reviewing licensing, planning, the whole regulation, to really try and remove some of this red tape. I think we've really got to go out of our way, and we want to see that in the bill to really support our businesses to recover from this economic crisis. But I think it's also more fundamentally looking at some of those smaller businesses and the challenges that face. There's been lots of measures in place with the furloughing scheme, which seems as though that may come to an abrupt end. There's also been the rental holidays and different, obviously different aspects that have been put on the table for businesses to benefit from. But what happens when that all ends? And I think as soon as those doors open, they're still going to need that ongoing support for many, many months more. So I know there's a fine fiscal balance to be had here, but I do think some tax incentives, absolutely. And I think looking at company debt also needs to be included in the bill as well. And what those instruments look like, I don't know, but I just think that there has to be something in there to support the business sector as these lockdown measures are eased.
And one thing in the build up to this, Simon, I think you talked about a sense of community and mental health, the importance of well-being. So we've talked about economic and public realm, but there seems to be a wider role of support that it can play here.
Yeah, I think, when businesses are looking to reoccupy, and with their reoccupancy will come the return of the retail and return of the community and the economic success of an area. So that is really vital. But when businesses are looking to reoccupy, they will want their staff to feel safe coming back to an area. They'll want to be able to exit their public transport system, bus or tube, into the area successfully. And if you take some of the central London stations, they are overcrowded places with narrow pavements. They'll want to be able to come into an area which is clean, not necessarily because that gives you less chance of infection, but it creates a sense that it's a hygienic place that is fresh and inviting to return to. They'll want to see, I think, everybody behaving in the same way. They want to see a uniformity. They want to see some rules that are being obeyed collectively. And that's where communication comms and the strategies that bids put in place alongside their occupying businesses can really come to the fore in getting those businesses engaged and getting their workforces engaged. So there's a common understanding of how to operate. And then I think it's just down to street management, looking at what systems are put in place on wider pavements, perhaps one-way walking systems, for example, 2-metre distancing, a lot of signage and branding. And then the bit that we haven't touched on too much yet is the role of the street teams in all this. I'm sure that the new West End Company street teams are extremely busy today, trying to sort things out in Oxford Street. And that will be the case for some of the other West End centres, probably not quite so hectic. But those street teams are excellent on a normal day. I'm sure they will really come into their fore during this period, just providing reassurance, communications, information, and adjusting operating systems throughout the day. You know, if something's not quite working as we expected it to, those teams are on the ground to put things right.
And yeah, and I guess the longer we go in through it, you know, the longer we go through, hopefully the more that confidence will, you know, build. Now I've got the results from that actually of that last poll. Encouragingly, actually, 42% of the webinar viewers are feeling confident, which I think is very good. First day back, things, you know. 38% are, you know, slightly uncertain, and there's 20% hesitant. I mean, obviously, and the government advises for people who can work from home should still work from home, isn't it? So we're still at home. So I guess until things move further, I've got actually, before letting you go, there's a final poll which is a bit more fun, which hopefully can come up in a second. I've got a question, you know, a couple of questions. David Lawrence says, how does the panel think that we can avoid central London becoming a giant car park over the next few weeks? So yeah, one of the fears is public transport, can it cope with this wave of, you know, visitors? If confidence returns too quickly, you know, could that have a detrimental effect? Maybe over to you, Ruth, on that, because your areas are you know, quite more diverse in terms of, you know, some people could potentially drive through to the city, could they, and block it up?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've all spent many years, particularly bids, really promoting the environment, air quality. We've just spoken about freight consolidation to try and obviously reduce all of that. So of course we don't want to encourage cars coming in. However, we have this huge conundrum in that people don't want to use the public transport network. Now, until that narrative changes in terms of more positive communication around being able to use the transport infrastructure, then people will feel more encouraged to want to drive in as opposed to use other methods, which albeit the public transport system. There's a lot of people that can obviously, you know, walk, cycle or get into London that live in and around the central London boroughs, but the large proportion of people live in the home counties and those outer London boroughs, and it's how they're actually going to be mobilised to come back in. I had a really good example today. I had a couple of staff coming into the city actually just to see what's open today, and they were going to get the training. So we know that Network Rail have reduced it down to a 25% capacity. We've looked at what those bottlenecks might be outside the station, all of the street management and how that will be managed. But then you've got the train operators. Both their trains were cancelled, so they couldn't actually physically get in. So I do think that obviously that there needs to be more work done with our transport operators in terms of how we can mobilise the workforce to come back in. And until that changes, I just think it's a very, very difficult problem that we've got.
It's a really good, on that point, Olivia Harris, WPA chair, has asked about the 2-metre rule, where there's something else that Nikki would have spoken about. I know Nikki has mentioned in our kind of regular weekly calls with her and other businesses, you know, she's campaigning for that 2-metre rule to be reduced because of the impact on schools, on the hospitality industry, on travel. Do you think it would, you know, perhaps going over to Kay first, do you think it would make much difference if that was reduced, you know, to your business or location?
I think internally, in F&B internally, it's going to be the difference between survival and not. For in an external environment, I think what we saw on Oxford Street this morning outside some of those retail units, it's 2 metre, 1 metre, 50 metre didn't really make a difference. Human behaviour, you know, there's sort of an excitement about the reopening of shops on Oxford Street. We've been asked for comments on it, and I do think it's a really difficult one, because we don't want to be pushing something that, you know, there is going to be a scientific review. We don't know much. We don't know enough about the virus to know exactly. We know that, you know, how it responds to air conditioning. We know how it responds to it, but do we? And I think that, you know, that's the problem. So none of us want to be held as saying that. But I do know internally in restaurants, cafes, and pubs, that is the difference, and they've all made that quite clear. That is the difference between sink or swim for some of these, and the ability to reopen. And as Ruth said, you know, making sure that those amenities are there, not just for people who work in the area, but for people who live in the area. Because I think that, you know, we take it for granted that some of these cafes and restaurants and pubs are there for maybe a corporate sector, and actually they also serve a very important neighbourhood amenity. But they can't survive with just the neighbourhood amenity. It takes the corporate sector as well to make some of these outlets viable. So we need sufficient corporate sector as well. And back to the car park point, I just wanted to come in and support what Ruth just said as well. We've been inundated with requests from our businesses for lists of car parks, which we have reluctantly produced and put on our website. And of course, we're on the congestion charge boundary, so we've got one side of congestion charge in ULEZ, other side of congestion charge in ULEZ. And some of ours are still full of NHS workers. This is going to be really interesting as to what actually happens. So some of those car parks have still got deals where they're providing free parking for Stop at St Mary's. And actually now you've got office workers being prepared to pay an awful lot of money to park in that car park. It'll be quite interesting to watch what happens on those, but it's a really difficult conundrum.
And that would be, yeah, I mean, kind of ironic, wouldn't it? Just as an opportunity to try and transform streets for the better, improve air quality, which people have appreciated. Of all the negatives in this, there's been some positives in terms of air quality and traffic. For that to be reversed in one fell swoop, when longer term, I guess it's behaviour change across the board in terms of dealing with how you behave in this. Look, I wanted to end on a positive, unless anyone had a really pressing point. But I mean, from WPA's and CPA perspective, we really enjoy working with all the bids across the city and West End. They're so important to us, our board members, our wider members, and you know, we hear, you know, lots about, you know, MWEC and Hull, but we hear about all the bids, but they all have different roles in different areas, and you guys have really focused in terms of the, you know, the specifics of an area and the importance, and I think do incredible work. So thank you for sharing that with us. One thing, you know, with the final poll, what do you miss about, you know, coming into central London? It's what the 54%, not surprisingly, post-work drinks. I think we all miss a drink after work, or with friends, or whatever. Lunch meetings. Well, I think that's Jace Tyrrell. He has lots of lunch meetings. That's 43%. Sorry, Jace at MWEC. And 12% Mr. Barrister Coffee. But it's, we all, I think it's fair to say we all miss it, and all looking forward to going back in a safe, controlled environment, which the bids and our members and people working, you know, with Westminster and City of London and TfL working hard to do. So on that positive note, hopefully see you for post-work drinks or lunch or a physical seminar in the not too distant future. Thanks all. Thanks.